Yep. Yep. Mr. Speaker, in 1957 in Hungary, there was a rebellion where people wanted more autonomy from the power of the USSR. The USSR clamped down on this rebellion by first shutting down all dissent, by murdering people who were dissenting in the streets, and using other methods to shut down anything that they had. Why did this dissent come up in the first place? We believe that when the USSR existed, the people of these fringe countries or the people of Eastern European countries firstly did not have any representation in the political bureau, which led to a situation where funds were not allocated to them, which led to a state of underdevelopment where these countries were not developing at the same rate as internally in Russia, like Moscow and St. Petersburg and stuff. So this creates a situation where even within the larger Soviet Union, all these countries were extremely unhappy because of the undemocratic way that the Soviet Union has been set up and the way it continues to be set up till today. And what did the USSR do apart from this? They impose their language upon these people to try and solidify this shared cultural identity, which we dispute from the very beginning existed and which we believe even today does not exist. We believe that this is a narrative that Putin propagates for him to go through this expansionist policy of creating a larger Soviet Union and Russia. Along with this, they also erased and standardized history textbooks to make it look like the Soviet Union was the best possible solution for these people, which led to an erasure or an undermining of the identities that these people had previous to the Soviet Union coming into power. For example, the Austro-Hungarian identity or the Czech or Balkan identity, which we believe has been undermined and undercut to a great extent by the narrative that has been propagated by the Soviet Union. On active distancing, three things. Firstly, what do we mean by active distancing? We mean, firstly, we will stop commemorating achievements of the Soviet Union because we believe that the harm that they have caused to us has been far, far greater than the small achievements that may have happened. Secondly, we will actively distance ourselves from the Russian language and we prioritize our own languages over that, which would be like the Hungarian language or the Czech language or other languages that exist in Eastern Europe. We believe that these languages have been trampled down by Russia and the Russian language. Also, apart from this, we will actively propagate and prioritize pre-USSR history and pre-USSR identities that these people had, which have been shut down. Okay, what does this signal, right? We believe that this signals two things primarily. It signals firstly that as Eastern European countries, there is no aspirational value for us to go ahead and join the USSR because we do not see any tangible benefits coming to us through that. Secondly, it also signals to the world at a greater level that yes, there are no benefits coming to us and we see ourselves better off democratically. Thirdly, it also signals to people within Russia internally who are being told by Putin that all these people want to come back and we should form a Soviet Union again, that no, countries like Estonia are not interested and that we want to stay away from Russia. Why do we need this and why is active distancing in this debate extremely necessary? We believe that the methods being used by someone like Putin are extremely subversive. I'm going to draw a parallel between how he meddled in the US elections, right? They go ahead and hack like Facebook and all and try to create this narrative of truth when they try to influence people within your own country into believing certain things, right? And we believe this is exactly what he's trying to do in Eastern Europe as well. He's trying to go ahead and tell people that, oh, it's in your best interest to join Russia in the face of this kind of subversive methods and in the face of false narratives and alternative facts that someone like Putin is known to use. We need to have active distancing, which has to be really explicit in the form of the government coming ahead and saying it. On the idea of Putin, right? Historically, how has Putin acted? We believe firstly, what is Putin's motivation, right? We believe that Putin's motivation of acting against Eastern European countries is not that he's going to act in a reactionary manner, oh, you have joined NATO, so I'm going to take revenge on you because I believe this is detrimental to Russia. It functions rather on him believing that he has a birthright to control this whole larger area. So this means whether or not countries go ahead and join NATO or whether or not countries do stuff like that, he has a larger plan to go ahead and annex these countries anyway, right? So we see a probability of violence regardless of us going ahead and actively distancing ourselves or not. So this creates a situation of where are we better off, right? We believe we are necessarily better off in a situation where our people know that culturally we are going to be hegemonized and that our own identities are not going to exist because that allows us to fight against them even if they do go ahead and invade and makes it harder for Putin to hold on to this territory militarily, right? Okay, in terms of history, how is this panned out, right? We believe in 1998 when Putin came to power, he initially had a soft stance where he tried to create this shared identity by going ahead and saying that, okay, Eastern Europe is a cauldron of culture where we all are really, really similar. We believe that that approach has largely changed when he became really militaristic in terms of pandering internally, firstly to Russians by telling them, oh, we need to return to the glory days of the Soviet Union and we need a larger Russia for us to be relevant globally. And secondly, by creating this rhetoric in Eastern European countries that it's in your best interest to join Russia, we will provide you much more benefits. We do not think he actually wants to provide benefits. We only believe he wants that territory because he has a really big ego. On the idea of military, right? On the idea of military, we believe that he's only going to use military methods because in terms of political action, we don't see any way that Putin will go ahead and do this. This means when he goes ahead and does invade, how do we fight back against that, right? We believe that the only method to fight back against that is where we have a culture where people know the kind of atrocities that have been committed and the kind of power that Russia is and the kind of method that they want to use. If people within our own country, like separatists in Ukraine, are able to propagate a narrative that tells even like a sizable minority in your country that, oh, it's in the best interest of us to join Russia, we believe that is extremely problematic. So we have proven to you that these people existed on the core, on the periphery, and there was no state of development for them. So the EU, or even like being independent as they are now, is better for them in terms of benefits that they want to accrue to themselves. On a comparative, why did they go ahead and invade Ukraine and Crimea and not Estonia? We believe that Estonia went and joined NATO, but still there was no invasion by Russia because it does not fit into their larger plan of what they want to do. This means that they will go ahead and do these things when they see benefits for themselves. So they went ahead and invaded Crimea because there's a Russian language base there, and he saw a method for him to keep it by pandering to people within that place, right? When we believe that the methods of violence used also by Russia are twofold, right? First are direct in terms of the military actually going in, but the second and more dangerous are indirect methods where they go ahead and create this rhetoric, create separatists, and create this fringe element that goes ahead and says that, oh, it's in our best interest to join Russia, and which will be funded by Russia as well, which exacerbates internal problems that we believe Eastern European countries are having, leading to situations of worse violence in this debate. Moving on, we believe on the question of Trump, right? Lastly, we believe that even though Trump has gone ahead and said that, okay, I'm not in favor of NATO because the amount of money US is putting in, and he's an isolationist, we don't believe that figures into this debate to a large extent, because isolationism for him is economic isolationism, and on issues such as migration and people coming into the US. We believe that national security of the United States is still an extremely important part of the way Trump is going to administrate. And the moment Russia goes ahead and tries to create like a Soviet Union kind of entity, it does go ahead and undermine the national security of the US, and like people in Senate and all are going to question on it. And we believe Trump is pragmatic enough to respond. So we believe in a situation like this, Trump is going to respond. Because like when situations like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Red Scare have happened, it's going to be really difficult for him internally to justify why he thinks that the Soviet Union should still exist. This gives Trump enough of an incentive to respond. Two consequences coming out of this. Firstly, cultural capital is created in our favor when he's actively trying to go ahead and undermine us. We believe it's important that we take a proactive stance on this to go ahead and undercut what he's trying to do. Second, we believe that we are undercutting his possibility of creating internal party support by like coming up with parties who go ahead and say that it's in our best interest to join Russia and stuff like that. Because now we have like a singular narrative that we are propagating by saying that however else we are off, the Soviet Union is our worst option. With that, I'm very proud of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, in an age of increasing Russian influence and a crumbling of the Western bloc, we think we need to really think about what we do when we decide to dissociate ourselves with this Soviet history that we've shared, right? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things that on our side of the house, but before that, I'm going to deal with a couple of rebuttals, right? Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that the USSR imposed a certain language on people during the Soviet era. There was standardized education, etc., etc. We think that post that, the Soviet Union fell. And we think that there was enough criticism at that time given to the situation that existed at large, right? We think that, in fact, because of the win of the Western liberal democracy, there was increased pressure on the Soviet Union in terms of what it had done and all the terrible things that had happened, right? We think post the fall of the Soviet Union, right now, our government needs to justify why you would actively dissociate yourselves from this history, right? Because we think, ladies and gentlemen, when they say that we will promote ethnic languages, we think it's easier said than done, right? Because we think for years and years, people within Eastern European countries have been speaking Russian. And we think in that particular context, they need to justify how all of these policies are going to be met. But before that, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you the nature and the context within which we exist today, right? The context within which we exist today is one in which the Western bloc is crumbling. We think that there are enough burdens and enough crises that the Western bloc is dealing with. So we think that Brexit is one of the issues. We think there is a refugee crisis that is looming at heart. We tell you that there has been a rise of right-wing nationalism with people like Marine Le Pen coming into focus and gathering massive amounts of support. Individuals who are increasingly isolationist and don't tend to care about what's happening in the world around them. We think in terms of a lot of problems that the European bloc is dealing with, in terms of the fact that there is a Euro crisis going on, we tell you that even the bastions of support, for instance, Angela Merkel, are too busy in terms of their internal domestic policy in Germany. We think there are divisions between Germany and Hungary that exist. We tell you even people who before this stood for us, people who are upholders of liberal democracy, for instance, United States of America, ladies and gentlemen, are being problematic on two folds. Number one, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that they're being isolationists. They no longer consider certain things that they valued a lot in the past. For instance, NATO, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that Trump, for instance, has called for cutting of funding for NATO, has argued for things like members of NATO should actively pull their weight, all implying that he is less interested in international relations, less interested in the power of the NATO and what the NATO stood for, which is standing up for all those people who believe in a liberal democracy. So we tell you that when Crimea was invaded, the United States of America did literally nothing, right? Because in that context, because of the kind of funding that was cut for NATO. We think, moreover, ladies and gentlemen, Trump is also looking inwards in his massive cahoots with the Russian government, right? We think, ladies and gentlemen, this we see in appointments that he makes, such as Rex Tillerson, and in his inability to admit the kind of Russian influence that happened during the election, right? But we think, ladies and gentlemen, it's important at this time to talk about Putin, and we agree with them. We think Putin is an egomaniac. We think he is a megalomaniac. And ladies and gentlemen, we think that he thinks that you're either for him or either with him or against him. We think we agree with all of the characterization that, of his belief in this of nationalism, of his belief in this idea of a motherland, in his belief of going back to the glory of the past days, and his belief that Eastern European countries are his birthright. We think at that point of time, when you actively dissociate with him, we think you necessarily aggravate him. And we think this is a time of growing Russian influence, right? We think especially when the Western bloc is beginning to look inward, we think Russia at this point of time is expanding, it's aggressive, it's expansionist. We think at that point of time, we need to make sure that we aren't on Putin's radar, because we think Putin at this point of time, when we dissociate with him and when he considers, especially by their characterization, that Eastern European countries are his birthright, we think it's going to be a massive fuck you to him if we say that we are going to talk about a lot of other things, we're going to actively attempt to dissociate ourselves from him. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the kind of person that Putin is that he believes in the glory of the past days, he believes in the glory of the motherland, and in so, he crushes down on all kinds of dissent that exists. So for instance, ladies and gentlemen, he gunned down one of the most prominent individuals who stood up against him in broad daylight, all indicative of the fact that he would crush down all dissent. We think, ladies and gentlemen, when he realized that Hillary Clinton wasn't someone he liked, we think he interfered with the United States elections, which shows two things. One, that he isn't going to take any altercation against him lightly, and second, that he has an increasing growing influence and a growing sphere of influence, right? And at that point of time, ladies and gentlemen, we think when Eastern European countries, not only do they share this kind of history and so on and so forth, but also, ladies and gentlemen, are reliant on Russia for a lot of things, for instance, for trade ties and stuff, and are also on the border. We think at that point of time, Russia and Putin's ability to fuck with Eastern European states is that much more. We think he can do this through a variety of ways. He can meddle with our internal politics. We think he can impose sanctions. We think there can be border skirmishes the second he realizes that we are against him, and which he will necessarily think when we go ahead and say that we're going to actively dissociate from all things that he stands for. We think at that point of time, his ability to meddle with, for instance, within Eastern European countries, the ethnic groups that continue to believe in Russia and continue to be Russian at heart, that his ability to, for example, provide armed support are all things that are possible. We think at that point of time, what we're doing is, ladies and gentlemen, not glorifying this past, because we think the burden is on that side of the house to show us why an active dissociation is something that's good. Because on our side of the house, we aren't re-emphasizing these sides, right? We think we're maintaining status quo, which is it's not like we're glorifying or celebrating what is happening. We think at that point of time, it's their burden to tell us why at this point of time you need to actively dissociate, because we think when we can't turn to allies who in the past would have stood by us. So all of the examples that they use of Hungary, etc., we think in the past maybe it made sense to ally ourselves with the United States of America because it was really powerful, because it cared about ensuring that Western liberal democracies tried.
Would Angela Merkel like troops of Russia on her borders?
Ladies and gentlemen, here's the thing, right? We think that violence is, and the likelihood of violence is not inevitable. We think it's more likely to happen on that side of the house the second that Putin decides that he sees these people as aggressors, especially when they characterize Putin. And especially when they characterize Putin as an individual who will do whatever he wants. And we tell you at this point of time, Angela Merkel has a lot to deal with, right? We think that there is a crisis going on within her. She's trying to win another re-election bid. We think there is a lot that she needs to focus on. We tell you, within this also, there is a rise of right-wing nationalism, like I spent the first minute of my speech talking about. So with people like Marine Le Pen gaining a lot of ground, right? We think these people are increasingly isolationist and don't believe in the propagation of these liberal values, aren't as interested as United States during the Cold War era, which when it wanted to make sure that it came to the aid of all people who stood up for liberal democracy. We don't think that kind of situation exists, because we think at this point of time, the United States and the Western liberal bloc that was a traditional ally against Russia is no longer serving its purpose of a traditional ally, because we think it's looking inward. We think it has a lot on its hands. We think with Brexit, with the European crisis, we think they are dealing with a lot of problems. And even at that point of time, given that there is so much within domestically that they have to focus on, we think it's that much harder for them to focus on it.
The basic question you guys need to ask yourselves before judging this debate is, what would happen if we do not take a move to culturally distance ourselves from the Soviet Union idea which Putin holds? There are two problems with this. Firstly, if we do not distance ourselves, or if we do not dissociate ourselves from the narrative of a greater Russia, then funded elements in these countries who have a vested interest to listen to Putin, for example, fringe parties which still believe in the Russian identity, do not get legitimized. For instance, if we do not uphold the Russian languages, these fringe elements do not feel the need to go ahead and propagate their own ideology. So the implication of this is, this means that Russia cannot assume support of these elements, because the narrative in the country of Estonia or Finland is that we do not want to be pro-Russia. Hence, we think this is the first reason we should go ahead and take this move. But more importantly, let's look at the method Putin employs, right? These are clandestine, these are subtle, these are subversive. It amounts to hacking Facebook. It amounts, even if in non-militarist positions, to convince his own domestic population that these countries want our intervention. How does Putin go ahead and, not right now, how does Putin go ahead and convince Moscow that these countries want your intervention? He goes ahead and does this by saying, look at these countries, they like the Russian language, they like our festivals, they like to sing our songs. At the point in which, when Estonia says, no, we will not commemorate the Politburo, we will not commemorate our war heroes, the signal he sends to the world is simple. The signal this sends is that we do not want your intervention. Hence, it becomes tougher for Putin to justify his military action to his own domestic populace by saying that these countries want it. Thirdly, what does this bode for us? What does an ideology of a greater Soviet Union bode for us? And that's a principal argument in this debate. Historically, we have seen that the Soviet Union is an expansionist union. More importantly, it's one which weakens internal democracy, in as much as countries which are not Russia are not allocated funds properly, countries which are not Russia are not allowed to dissent, and countries which are not Russia are not given political representation. Hence, if we do not oppose him in status quo, he assumes the mantle of being the big brother, he assumes the mantle of ensuring that he has a birthright to go ahead and do this move, and no one in the world can oppose him, which is something he tried to do a spin in Crimea. What did he do in Crimea? He looked at one element of Crimea which wanted to be Russian, posed to the world, put headlines on Russia Today saying, look at them, they really want our rule, right? This is the kind of methods he employed. In a Ukraine which had actively distanced itself, this would have not been possible. Crimea's intervention would not have been possible, which is why we want to take these methods. Let's come to my constructive phase, but before this, 3 targeted rebuttals. Number 1, we think the fact that Russian influence is increasing is all the more reason to go ahead and oppose him, without which he will literally trample on us. Secondly, what is post-99 Russia? Has it felt like it needs to repent for its sins? No, it hasn't. Neither Boris Yeltsin nor Medvedev and neither Putin have gone ahead and issued apologies for the kind of atrocities which the Soviet Union had committed. Side opposition is lying to you when they're saying they've repented for their sins or they're contrite. The reason they're not contrite is because these people still believe in the inherent ideology that we are more superior to Eastern European countries. Hence,
And even potential for these countries for Russia to rule us means we will be second-class citizens, an act we do not want as a democratic country. But more importantly, what has happened after 1991 in these countries? Solidify their own identity in as much as they've tried to create nationalist movements in Hungary. Hungary wanted to preserve its language, and Hungary is doing that by making it compulsory in its schools. All of these efforts get undermined if Russia goes ahead and assumes that they are culturally similar to us. Because cultural affinity signals are very important. Not right now. Cultural affinity shows you that there's an aspiration for you to be a part of Russia. In the absence of this aspiration, we do not think Putin can capitalize on these efforts. And for all of these reasons, we think the first speech doesn't stand. But let's come to a constructive case. And we have, not right now, 3 things for you. Firstly, what do Putin's statements and actions reveal about his intentions? We've often repeated to you that the idea of a big brother is one which the temptation of which Putin wants. Hence, if we give Putin the idea that you can come to us or culturally we are similar, it's an invitation to a military intervention, right? The reason it's an invitation to a military referendum is twofold. One, domestically, he can justify his actions. 2, internationally, he can justify his actions by showing that, these people want us. Secondly, what is this cultural affinity we are talking about? He told you that the only thing we are doing is we are not commemorating war heroes. We aren't abusing Putin. We aren't telling him he's an idiot. Merely we are going and saying that our national identity is more important than yours. And what does this signal? And what has precedent taught us? Estonia went ahead and joined the NATO. It wasn't militarily bombed. Why? Because Putin saw no reason in bombing Estonia. Hence, precedent has shown us that even if a country goes ahead and actively distances itself, not the kind we are talking about, like joining the NATO, they still were not bombed. Hence, they need to show us what is the inevitability of this violence they're talking about. But before that, we'll come to why this violence is not inevitable in our case. Before that, sir, your POI.
Whatever you said, Ukraine did the exact same thing before Crimea. They tried to impose.
Why is Ukraine a different situation?
But yet they were made.
Fair enough. Why is Ukraine a different situation? Ukraine had a rebellion where they did not want to join the EU, right? However, what signaled to Russia the demand that Ukraine wants to be there? Parties in Sevastopol, parties in port areas of Crimea signaled that we want your help. And how did Putin do this? Putin put people in normal clothing in Crimea and gave them military attire and said, look, they want our help. Hence, if we culturally distance ourselves and if we show no signs of affinity, they will not invade us. But more importantly, what are the other checks which keep Russia from invading us? Which is my third constructive. What is going to be the kind of response from the world? Twofold, right? Number one, and America, even if it's isolationist, there's an inherent incompatibility between make America great again and an expansionist USSR. In other words, Trump determined his status as a world leader, even if he's an isolationist one, because make America great again implies that he has to justify first to the Republican Party why the Red Scare, why the communist purge is not an important thing, and how we can be so close to Russia that we let go of human rights and be intervening in Eastern Europe. Secondly, now Trump has to justify to his own domestic populace that why should we intervene when Russia has been inimical to our interests since the days of the Cold War, since the days of the Pigs of the Bay massacre. Second, where does the response of the world come from outside the US? Twofold. We believe countries like Germany and France, on whose borders troops will now be stationed, have an active interest, even though they're isolationist, in reducing the scare. For instance, Germany will call out Trump for doing this because Germany doesn't want Russian troops on its borders, and neither does France. These are two checks which show that violence is not inevitable. They have to answer to us why violence is an inevitability in the kind of examples we've given them, because without that, they're running a case with mere analysis without any example of how this has been done. For all of these reasons, we're extremely proud to propose.
Right, so ladies and gentlemen, let's begin with what both sides agree upon, right? We both agree that clearly Putin is this guy who is really, really powerful, and the fact that Russian influence, or rather an increasing sphere of Russian influence in Europe particularly, is something which is an inevitability. They themselves have said that, look, America is problematic. And of course, Russia is growing in power, and we don't think they can deny the fact that since the time of since 1990, since the time of Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union, since then Putin has spearheaded and has been the flag bearer for this type of Russian resurgence. We think particularly when the Western blocs are right now at their weakest since they've been for the past 20, 30 years. We tell you this Russian sphere of influence is something which we over the next 10, 20, 15 years is bound to increase, right? Yes. Right? We both agree upon that, right? And now, like the PM said, it's about the better scenario, right? Which side gives you the better scenario, and where Eastern European countries will be better placed, right? What we argue from our side is this idea that given the fact that Russian influence is already inevitable, and it is something that is increasing, what we need to do is make sure that we are not deemed as an immediate threat to the idea of Russian identity or Russian sphere of influence, or rather Putin himself, because he's an egomaniac. We tell you that the first thing Putin does is prioritize the killing of his enemies. We tell you that the first thing Putin does is that when he feels that this birthright that they call the Eastern European countries is being threatened, at that point of time, we tell you military intervention is that much more likely, right? And that is where the example of Ukraine comes into play, where we asked Rowan that question. What did Rowan say? Rowan said that, look, within Ukraine, there were parties, within Crimea, there were parties who said, hey, Russia, we need your help. We think this will happen in all other Eastern European nations in their scenario, right? Why? Because what does actively disassociate themselves mean? Like they said, it is about trying to move away from the linguistic, ethnic identity of perhaps being Russian and shared past, and rather bring about their own independent nationalistic identity. At the same time, these ethnic minorities, these linguistic minorities, which do associate themselves with Russia at this point in time in Eastern Europe, still do exist. So when you see that the state government is now telling you that, hey, these minorities are something which we don't care about, and we want to move ourselves away from these minorities, we tell you that at that point in time, it legitimizes Putin's attempt to say that, look, they are cracking down on the Russian ethnic minority, and they need our help, and so I will intervene. This is what happened in Crimea. What happened? We tell you that when Putin said that his birthright, that is Ukraine and other Eastern European nations, is being a threat to him and to his greater Russian identity, he intervened. So the invitation of a military intervention, we believe, is more likely in their scenario, because we tell you that, like they themselves said, Putin is an aggressor, and an aggressor attacks when he is feeling threatened. The threat will come from the fact that randomly an Eastern European country which shared cordial relations, great trade ties, has a shared history, and has ethnic minorities in that country, immediately try to aggressively disassociate, and this aggressiveness will be to a certain extent violent, disassociate themselves from this, or from all of the things that have happened in the past. We tell you Putin will feel that he is losing his birthright. What is our scenario? We tell you our scenario is that of not complete appeasement, in terms of we're not going to lay the carpet out for Putin to come and invade us, but we must still keep our domestic politics. We're going to still make sure our borders are secure. But yet, we believe that we're going to maintain cordial ties with Russia to the extent that Russia already feels that, hey, perhaps we have enough influence, or they are close enough, and hence it is not a priority to go and intervene on their scenario. And we think at this point in time, the ability of Putin to grant us more independence, or rather not interfere, is much more in our scenario, because it feels that we are not threat to the greater Russian identity. We tell you it is about threats, right? And now look, it perhaps works in an ideal case. Like, sure, we want to tell Putin to fuck off, and we want our independent ideology, and we want to disassociate ourselves. They want opposition. In a scenario which is ideal, we would have this opposition, right? But we tell you, what is worse than an opposition? The worst thing is an ineffective opposition against Putin. When that happens, then your opposition, once your opposition crushed, Putin's ability to dominate affairs is that much more. We tell you that this opposition will be ineffective. Analysis didn't clash whatsoever in the personal speeches about the Western bloc falling. We tell you that the American ties with Russia has never been greater than it has been right now with Trump's administration, with Rex Tillerson, with the fact that he tried to influence elections. We tell you that even under Obama, America was looking inwards, because when Crimea happened, no one really gave a shit. We tell you that Eastern European countries are not legitimately part of NATO anyway, so it's not like that Western countries are clearly bound to intervene. We tell you that the only but comes is the fact that France and Germany, we don't think that's true at all. France, particularly after the terrorist attacks right now, we tell you that the left and that of trying to uphold liberal values is something that is being looked down upon and losing popular support. And that is why right now Francois Hollande is now has like approval rate of like 20%, right? And that is why Marine Le Pen is now poised to perhaps win the presidency of France. So we tell you that already French populism is that of inward, that of protecting borders. If some random Eastern European country gets invaded, they will not care, they will not intervene. Germany, Angela Merkel is already trying to maintain the EU together because she is the only leader of the EU. She's trying to handle the refugee crisis when it comes to negotiations. She's trying to run a re-election. They will also not intervene. We tell you that the world stage of intervention is over. That stage has passed. It does not work like in the Cold War where you intervene in Vietnam and we'll intervene as well. That stage has passed because of a general recognition of the fact that Russia is pretty freaking powerful. And because they are freaking powerful, we tell you, any opposition worth itself, any opposition will only be legitimate if it is effective. They haven't proved to us that it will be effective. They also haven't proved to us why Putin won't see this as opposition. So what is our scenario? What we argue right after this one? What we argue essentially is this idea that look, we don't make an opposition out of it. We make sure that the minorities within our Russian minorities within our country are happy and are peaceful. We make sure they get welfare. We make sure we try to run a welfare state to the extent where citizens are happy. Your question.
Assume one voice to be culturally separate from Russia, does that not stem the influence of parties which grew in Crimea that we want to be with Russia?
We don't, as a nation, stem this kind of one unified identity. I think it painted a very rosy picture of Eastern Europe to you guys. These are not nations that are very strong in their culture, identity, and nationalism and all of that stuff. They are in the brink of history. They don't know where they lie completely. There is division within Eastern European politics. Their only example is Estonia, and that is it. Right? We tell you that within Eastern European countries, there is divisions. There are a lot of pro-Russian feelings. Why? Because Eastern Europe was never truly involved in the Western Bloc. Because they were never truly involved in the Western Bloc, they've always been in the middle. Given the fact that they've always been in the middle, what will be an invitation for Putin to come in? We tell you the invitation will be where this middle ground is now lost, and it is a clear indication that we, so sociologically and historically linked to Russia, are moving towards America. And like Prachi told you, Putin does not see, Putin just sees two things. If you're with him or you're against him. That is it. A move towards the West will be perceived as a move against him and against his idea of Russia, and hence it will be problematic. We are not going to celebrate Russian historical ties, but at the same time, we're not going to actively dissociate ourselves. It doesn't make strategic sense to do so at this point in time. It goes against any realpolitik policy that we've implemented. We think it's a stupid move, and we are very, very proud to oppose.
Will you stand here and take a speech? I prefer standing and taking a speech. Yes, sir. I'll address the major themes, but before I do that, I'll counter-characterize what Tejas said in his speech because it was substantially different than what Prachi did in the first speech, right? We don't think the picture which Tejas presented of Eastern Europe is the real picture, right? We think Eastern Europe did go ahead and form an identity of its own. There were no minority groups which are Russian in their nature. There were no groups which wanted a USSR or a Russian influence. However, what has happened lately is that Putin has stepped in and has said that, well, you guys can join Russia, and that's why certain minority elements are hinging or lining towards him. But that's purely because of the fact that Putin is trying to do so, and not because they themselves feel that way. And another reason why this is happening is precisely their case, right? We think this is happening because these countries haven't taken an active stance of disassociating with USSR, which allows the space for Putin to step in and say that, well, you guys join us. So when he says that we want to climb down on minorities and suppress minorities, that's not the case at all. Putin wants to create fringe groups in our countries, that's the case. Now, let's move on to the comparative and let's understand why their model doesn't make sense. Because their model is basically that we won't dissociate, we won't actively go away from USSR. The problems with that are many, right? Because it's based on an understanding of the fact that Putin is expansionist. Now, in their model, Putin is not expansionist in a military manner, but is at least initially expansionist in social media or controlling the way elections matter. However, given that what happened in Crimea also proves that military action is inevitable in their scenario.
Why? Because in Ukraine government didn't actively go ahead and say that we are far away from Russia, which allowed the space for Crimeans to say that, well, we possibly might want to ally with Russia. This happened because Putin funded these things in Crimea and Ukraine sat down and allowed this funding. We think in their model this will happen when the moment these Eastern countries don't actively dissociate with Russia and tell their citizens that we are not part of Russia and we have identity of our own. How will this pan out? So pan out in three ways, right? One, we think our identity of our own will be strengthened. What we were pre-USSR will be stronger than ever before, and hence that needs to be taken into consideration. Secondly, we also talked about how language plays an important role, and thirdly, we don't want to commemorate USSR. But let's see what other things that Putin will do in their model, right? We think apart from invading militarily, Putin will also go ahead and ensure that fringe elements rise up in these countries. He will go ahead and ensure that there are parties who are in support of Russia simply by funding them. Now, this does not mean that these are minorities who actually support Russia. This simply means Putin is funds them. We know that the kind of megalomaniac he is, given that they also accept it, we think these are the kind of things he'll do. On a third level, we also think that he'll try and control the way politics functions in our nation. So whenever there's a leader who stands for strong Estonian or strong Czechoslovakian identity, Putin will actively come here and suppress these people. We think these are the things we don't want. We think these are the things which come by in their model and not in ours. Now let's understand the comparative from our side, right? Is there a high possibility of violence happening in our side or not? With that, their argument has continuously been that you are going to aggravate Putin, because of which Putin will come to your country and kill all of you. Two responses to the fact that he won't do it in our model. Why? Because Putin justifies military intervention by saying that there are Russians there who are dying, who don't have space, who don't have enough thing to say. We think the fact that in our model, the fact that we don't have Russian sympathizers ensures that Putin doesn't do it. One. Two, Putin justifies these actions to his people simply by saying that Russians exist there and ready to save them. But third and very important level, we think the fact that he could invade Crimea was purely because of the fact that even the international community could justify that in Crimea Russians are living and I need to take the action, which reduced the ability of any international community going ahead and saying that no, what you're doing is wrong. This is because it's difficult for them to do so. However, in their model, this will happen. In our model, this will not happen. They needed to prove otherwise. But let's understand the international politics behind this and how international politics will pan out, right? We don't think Putin is going to invade, but let's see what other checks and balances exist. They say USA and European Union are not definite checks and balances. In terms of USA, let me give definite rebuttals to whatever they've argued. Their argument has simply been Trump is isolationist and Trump doesn't want to invade. However, the problem with that is that they don't understand how the politics of US is functioning right now. Why? Because Trump is against immigration, Trump is against trade allies being formed with other countries. He's isolationist in that regard. But he can't possibly be isolationist with regard to Soviet Union or Russia, simply because of the kind of sentiment which exists in USA, which is of blue and red, which means USA thinks that they are capitalist and Russia is communist, and the sentiment still prevails today. So Trump needs to rise up and say that this is bad. And evidence of this is how 30-40 Republican senators actively went and sent a letter to Trump saying that, well, Trump, you shouldn't be in cahoots with Putin, you shouldn't be in cahoots with Russia. That's the evidence of the fact that Trump needs to intervene in such a scenario, and that's a different second balance.
If you say that Trump really actually would care about it because he sees Russia as a communist bloc still, why does he not really care about NATO? And that's been said through his policies again and again.
I will respond to that. The problem with it is different, right? Right now, he doesn't see a reason. But the moment Russia goes ahead and says that, well, I want to invade in Eastern Europe, I want to play an active role in Eastern Europe, he will actively have to go ahead and take a stance on it because he can't justify that. There wasn't a definite response to Rowan's analysis of how Trump will deal with inaction. Trump will deal with inaction in his own country, right? They needed to give a response to that, something which they haven't done. We think Trump's inaction is worse off because it puts him at a bad pedestal. Even the sentiment generally in US is against Russia. Trump won't be able to justify it to his electorate. And let's come to EU and how nationalism works, right? Because in terms of European Union, they have continuously said that these are right-wing parties who won't necessarily want to support them. However, right-wing parties is not equivalent to parties who are in support of Russia, right? These right-wing parties are also nationalist parties who say things strongly of their government. Germany, France, Le Pen, Hollande, Merkel are all these people who think that if the security of the nation is at the best. So while they might disagree on whether immigrants should come in their nation or not, they think unilaterally on whether their country should be exposed to Russian threat or not. So we think Russia coming here and putting forces, the threat of Russia coming here and putting troops in Eastern European borders allows reason enough for all these people to ally with each other and saying that we are not fine with this and we'll stand against all these things no matter what. We don't think anyone can justify going ahead and saying this. Another thing they say is that, well, Merkel has elections. However, that's not to say that Merkel will deprioritize her national security over her election. The fact that she has elections, the fact that France has elections is all the more reason to go ahead and show that I'm handling the security better. And that's how elections definitely work, right? When you're able to prove in elections that I took care of you and your security, people stand to win those elections. We think Merkel and France have all the more reasons to do it. As a comparative, we think hence their model definitely fails because they haven't dealt with the kind of harms that come by. The harms which they impose on us are probabilistic. They may not happen given the analysis we have given to you with regards to how the multiple checks and balances exist. They're extremely probable.
Madam Speaker, unfortunately or fortunately, the environment is conducive to an increase in the Russian influence. Right? This debate isn't about how we can combat it, because we believe that as a bloc of Eastern European countries, we really don't have the kind of power that Russia does. This debate is instead about how we ourselves as a bloc place ourselves better in this world order and where we benefit from it. Right? And we think that on that, they really haven't proved any justification to how this message should be received. It's proof why this message, sure, is justified in sending out, right? About how there has no oppression and the oppression that we face as Eastern European countries, and how it will be justified in us sending this message. But they not once have dealt with the consequences that side opposition has analyzed for you in how this message should be received by Russia and the kind of encouragement that, and the kind of incentive structure you place in Putin to invade and intervene, right? But for the first theme of this debate, it's will Putin stop spreading this narrative when you start spreading this narrative that you were away from, and that when you start distancing yourself away from the Soviet Union, right? They say that the moment we do this, you send a message to him that you don't want him to intervene, right? They say, however, the cause of this intervention, the cause of this belief in him is the fact that he believes that he has a birthright to this. He believes in the glory of Soviet Union, and he has a very big ego, right? And then they say that, and then they fail to analyze how this message will be received, because they think it's very, that Putin will very simply take this message and say, okay, I won't intervene. We say that by their own very characterization, the fact that he sees it as a birthright, the fact that he has a very big ego, the fact that he sees that he can own it, the moment you try to take it away from him is when he will intervene. We saw this with Crimea, right? When they did this in Crimea, when Crimea tried to fight back, but instead what Putin did was see this as a threat to his idea of what Russia is and his idea to what a solidified, unified Russia is, and he went and intervened there, right? He didn't have to give any justification because the international community didn't care. And that's exactly what will happen to all the other Eastern European countries, because we are part of NATO, we are part of these other institutions, and we think that all other possible allies that we have are either in cahoots with Russia or are ready to take any interest in trying to intervene in international politics because they're too busy and concerned with what's happening internally, right? And we think that that's again a context that they haven't clashed with at all. But we told you how it will be seen in opposition to his Russian identity, as how it will be a big middle finger to him, given that this is the narrative that he's propagating, something that they agree. Given that he's propagating this narrative, the moment that you as Eastern European countries come up and say that we disagree, we are not part of this past, and we don't want anything to do with it, we think that he will take it as a contradiction, and you encourage him and you force him to do whatever he can do to this. It's exactly this characterization of him having a big ego, coupled with what we told you about how his priority is always enemies. The moment he sees any dissent, he shuts it down. He is a megalomaniac who will do anything to stay in power. We think that it's this characterization that will force him to do whatever he can to retain this power the moment he feels it flipping out away. Yeah.
In a comparative, would you want to distance yourself and signal to the world and the Russian populace that we do not want Russia? Or do you want a man who thinks it's his birthright to justify an intervention without you having one cultural voice?
Well, it's exactly this, right? As a comparative, we don't see us, this is the second question of this debate, right? On both sides, Russian influence is increasing, right? It's inevitable. The idea is, how do we benefit from it as a bloc? We think the moment we make an enemy of him, which is something that they haven't clashed with, you will make an enemy of him the moment you spread this narrative. The moment that you do that, you will ensure that he will do anything he can to stomp you out. He will stop trade ties from you. You are literally at his border, at his disposal. All the possible allies that you have are too busy doing something else. There is no alternative. It isn't 2002 where the NATO was powerful. The NATO is crumbling now. There is no one who can back you up, right? In that context, we think that you have nobody to latch onto, and you will fail because A, nobody cares about what's happening to Eastern European, to the Eastern European bloc, right? They aren't part of any any other international institution. No one places scrutiny on them, which is exactly why he was able to get away with Crimea. Then one example is Estonia, and the reason that Putin was okay with giving away Estonia and when they joined NATO was not because he didn't see any benefit from Estonia or because he doesn't care that much. It's because in his vision, Estonia wasn't as important a part of the Soviet past as the rest. However, when you are countries that are important to his vision, a vision that you have no say over, a vision that he decides, the moment you as the country in that vision say that we are not part of this is not true, we want to step away, we think you antagonize him and you encourage and you enable him to do whatever he can, given that we think that right now the growing sphere of Russian influence will allow him and will make conditions conducive to him being able to do this, right? We also think that Putin will always believe this, and he constantly thinks that he's expansionist, right? And we think that again on the idea of how there are people who are going to believe him. We don't think that these people will always exist. The moment we start spreading this narrative, it's not like people will stop listening to Putin. It's not like Putin will stop investing in people to listen to you and will stop investing and funding these people. We think instead what will happen is that this investment will increase. Putin will further try to intervene more. He will further try to be his slimy self and try to ensure that there are people and there is a strong enough opposition within these Eastern European blocs to this imposition. And we think that it's in that scenario where he doesn't have to justify his intervention, because what it will look like and what we can justify it as is that these people are taking an identity that a lot of people don't belong to and are imposing it on him. They're taking away our Russian past. And we think that in that, squashing minorities, which justifies his intervention, which makes it far more easier to justify to the international community by saying that they were taking away Russian past, they were people who wanted me back, and he can do this with even more funding, he can do this with even more investment. The idea isn't that this is the only thing that we can do. The idea is this worth doing? Is the cost that is associated with this move worth bearing, right? And we think that on that side, opposition has clearly analyzed to you that the cost is far too high. We don't have an alternative. We cannot fight Russia. They haven't been able to prove that Putin will not try to intervene and will not try to overstep his boundaries and his ability to try to say that he has control over us. And we think that it's in this paradigm where they fail to be able to win this debate on.
So tell me this, right? Why is it that Trump still had a forward-looking policy in terms of peacekeeping forces in Africa, despite the fact that you claim that he's actually inwards?
We think that again, it's Africa, and we think that when it comes to real policies, Trump isn't going to intervene with Russia's intervention in Eastern European blocs. We think that Trump has far too much to lose. We characterize to you how he is in certain cahoots with the Russian government, how their ties have never been shadier, how their ties have never been better, and we think that Trump benefits nothing from trying to oppose Russia simply because, again, that his priority, he may send peacekeeping troops to Africa because it costs nothing, but his priority is to look inwards. Right? His priority is to focus on the domestic. His priority is to focus on the industries that are happening right now and to not focus that much on spreading these liberal values. That's the mandate on which he was voted upon. That's the mandate in which he is supposed to abide by. And we think that it's because of this mandate which will ensure that he will have nothing to do with this particular intervention. He won't have to give any justification simply because it will seem legitimate that Putin is interfering because you are taking away these people's lives. We told you how it will look to them, how it will feel to them, given that these people have spoken this language for 60, 70 years. These people have grown up with this particular dialect. These people have grown up celebrating these figures. And we think that on that, it becomes far easier for them to justify this intervention and far easier to justify this imposition of Russian control. This debate, again, has to be judged on whether this move, not that it's justified, but whether it makes sense to do. Do we as Eastern European bloc, the countries, benefit from this move? We tell you it enables and encourages an already megalomaniac, egoistical man to come and take control of what he thinks he is. It will never change because he believes that it is birthright. It's over. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, let's go through the debate and see why we've clearly won, right? Three things. Number one, I'm going to be talking about in what case, like they themselves have made this narrative, in what case will military intervention or intervention of a bad kind say, is more likely. Theirs or ours, right? We think it's ours and I explain why. Number two, I'm going to be talking to you about what means to really actively disassociate, right? And number three, I'm going to be talking to you about these checks and balances, which they claim to be checks and balances, which through our analysis we've proven to you are really not, right? But number one, right? What does Krishna say in his speech, right? He says that, look, Putin believes that a reason for intervention is when he feels that these Russian minorities or these ethnic groups are being clamped down upon, that free speech is being taken away, and that now they're being truly not treated well or not treated as equal citizens, right? We tell you the same happened in Ukraine, right?
What does he say? He says that actually the Eastern European countries, these minorities do not exist anyway, and so this won't be the case because post 1990 we already had a national identity. That's a bit confusing, right? We don't think that's true, because in their first speech themselves they said that there are Russian-speaking linguistic minorities which exist, and we're going to actively try to stop that from happening and propagate our language instead. And also, what does reaffirming your own national identity mean? It essentially means that yes, linguistic identity, which means Russian newspapers and all, will now actually be funding will be cut on them. Rather, you'll focus more on your own national identity, and you'll see the minorities are something that we don't really need to be a part of. Schools will be changed to suit the majority's narrative rather than a minority's narrative. All these are signals of you clamping down on a minority. These signals will be read by Putin as such as well. We tell you that it is not possible for these minorities to not exist magically in Eastern European countries because of the fact that we have shared history for 70 years with the Soviet Union in the first place, and just post 1990 to 2017 was not enough to undo all their history in the first place. Given the fact that a lot of them still speak Russian and they continue to do so, and the family has been doing so since the 40s and 50s, we tell you that it's very difficult for them to see that minorities don't exist. So it's not even a fact clash. We've analyzed you how it's clearly possible that minorities do exist here. Given the fact that they do exist, the way they're going to propose a national identity are things like cutting of funding, are things of teaching it in schools. They said this in their first page. These will obviously be read as clamping down on minorities by Putin. And when this is read, according to their characterization itself, Putin will be able to justify his intervention, right? Coming to the idea of actively disassociating. The reasons they give for actively disassociating, and this is what Rohan said, is this idea that number one, signal to the world and the Russian people that we don't want to be you, right? Except the problem is that what is the value of this signal when no one is listening? We tell you Ukraine and Crimea sent the same signal for 10 years before it really happened. We tell you that this signal is something which will only be possible if it is effective when it is read by people and people do come for your support. We tell you this support is something which is made up. It doesn't exist, which can bring you to a third point of checks and balances, and just look through your sheets about argumentation, right? We tell you that Trump is someone who's intrinsically linked to Russia already, and to Putin specifically through business ties, through administrative ties, and through ties in his cabinet with Russia, ladies and gentlemen. So we tell you that the ability of Trump to even speak out against Putin till now has been none. He hasn't spoken about Putin at all directly against him or directly critiqued him. The fact that those 30 Republicans sent the notice and it didn't really matter, and it just bounced off and it just remained a notice and not policy, shows that Trump will not intervene. Africa and Europe is very different, right? They talk about European nationalism and hence they talk about borders. We tell you, European idea of national security now ends with their borders. It is not the Cold War idea of national security extending towards capitalist countries and opposition to communist countries. Your national security is the protection of your borders. That is the new right-wing idea. So it's not this idea of national security and hence will save Slovakia and Lithuania from Russian intervention. No, France won't give a shit. Instead, France will be like, as long as we are not having terrorist attack, we will be fine. What do we do in our case? We tell you that we don't make an opposition out of Putin. We tell you that already, current status quo, we are seen as allies of Putin because of trade allies, because of historical ties, and because of the fact that we already have shared certain cultural history. Given the fact that we already do so in the first place, we tell you this radical move of actively becoming opposition is not possible and it's strategically stupid because it doesn't make sense simply because these checks and balances we talk about do not exist. And Putin, in their calculation also, is a megalomaniac. He will tell you that if he sees a threat, he will squash it no matter what, and he will see us a threat in this scenario. There is no real need to do this right now, given the fact that Russian sphere of influence is already inevitable. These are something which said so. We are very, very proud to oppose.
Now, Mr. Speaker, from the very beginning, we have agreed with them that Russia's influence is increasing. So this essentially makes this debate about a comparative of where do these Eastern European countries have a better time, right? Or where can we be better off? So essentially what stands from speech one? We give you characterization and extensive argumentation on why even within the USSR, these states were very, very badly off, right? Because this core periphery relationship that existed and the state of underdevelopment that existed within them. So we believe that even in a state where Russian influence is existing, it makes sense for us to actively disassociate ourselves. So at least culturally, tomorrow after the intervention, we can make sure that he's not able to at least hold on to that territory and make that harder for him, right? If we buy into that premise that this is inevitable and Russia's influence is increasing and no one is going to answer, like if we call for support. But firstly, we don't buy into that because we believe that the motivation for Putin to go ahead and do this is not one where it's simply reactionary or he gets really aggressive and angry. We believe that Putin has been thinking about this for a long time, right? Right from 1998 when he first became the president of the USSR. So this means that he has an active plan where he thinks this is a birthright and he's going to go ahead and do it in like a very, very like planned and organized way, right? This is why in like Sevastopol, which is in eastern Ukraine, they sent out Russian troops in like pedestrian clothing and with like voter IDs and all to go and influence people to go ahead and vote for like the parties that supported Russia or wanted Eastern Ukraine to move towards Russia. We believe that these are the kind of methods that someone like Putin wants to use. He's not a reactionary or he's not someone who's aggressive and who's going to go ahead and fight against you just because you act against him. On the other hand, on the comparative, who is Donald Trump? We believe Donald Trump is a reactionary, but he's also very, very pragmatic. So this means that when Donald Trump sees that the national security interest of the USA and the largest rhetoric that he's been running his campaign and his presidency on about making America great is being undermined by the existence of the Soviet Union, he will be forced to go and act against it. For two reasons. Firstly, because the Republican Party principally has a big problem with communism and Russia and all they stand for. And secondly, because internally, everyone who has voted for him, everyone in the Midwest really hates Russia because of the Cold War and because of the Red Scare and because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This puts Trump in a really, really problematic position where we believe he will necessarily prioritize his own like interests and go ahead and fight against Putin or like go ahead and take action against Putin. We believe that the US did take action against Putin and Crimea, and they're lying when they tell you they did because they went and like cut trade ties and the ruble fell by like 20%. Right? Moving on the idea of European nationalism. On European nationalism, what have we told you? We believe that just because countries are becoming right-wing does not mean that they will not intervene because see, look at the geographical proximity between Russia and Western Europe. When Russian like troops move to the borders there, it is a national security threat for me, even if I don't want to invade, because you have to realize in this debate that Russia is expansionist. This means that Russia wants to take over more and more land. This creates a national security problem for all countries that are bordering Russia, including France, which under Marine Le Pen will be more than willing to go ahead and fight for other countries because now they see it as a national security issue for themselves and for the European Union in general, right? Moving on, in terms of the realpolitik issue of security, right? We believe in a right-wing like environment, this issue like becomes even more important, and this gives them more reason to go ahead and intervene, right? On the idea of identity, right? We believe that even though we have been making like progress forward in terms of making identities for ourselves, unless we have this narrative, we cannot crystallize those identities and create this uniform narrative where we can go ahead and get rid of all these subversive tactics or combat these subversive tactics that Putin is using, right? Which is extremely, extremely necessary for us because we have proven to you in this debate that the methods of violence and the methods that he's using are really indirect in terms of funding people, in terms of hacking and doing things like that. This means we need to take a proactive stance where we go ahead and acknowledge that he's doing these sort of things. Or three things I'm going to respond to that came out in Orbit. Firstly, that even in our scenario, parties will listen, right? Or parties will go ahead and support Putin. We believe that when we come out and actively take a stand as a government and as a nation, it becomes really difficult for parties internally to go ahead and justify things like this because we have shown to you that Russia has been really bad for us, so the Soviet Union was really bad for us. On the second idea, when they come out and tell us they're not part of any power bloc, we believe we've already proven to you how Estonia and Ukraine had like aspirational value and were part of like the EU, right? On the third idea, justifying the Russian past, right? And this is the most important thing. We believe that they cannot go ahead and do this because tomorrow we have no aspirational value and Russia can never say that we have any aspirational value to be like part of them. This means that it's very difficult for him to justify it either internally to his own people or externally to the rest of the world or to the people of that country. Given all this, we stand here to
just balance as I just wanted to try to one or actually still balance, especially So then ballot you also don't discuss the progress of this.